Someone asked me on the Kickstarter messages, what are characteristics of a good horror game? And I was a little taken aback by the question because I didn't really know how to answer it. It's not something I had thought about before, but it is definitely something that deserves consideration, and it's a difficult question to answer. Well, I guess the easy answer, of course, is just to say scariness. You know, how scary is a horror game? But I think the question is more at the root of how do you create that scariness. But also, I think there's different things you can do with horror that's not necessarily scary. I started reading some manga by my cheat sheet went away. I think it's Junji Ito. I think it may be just Junji Ito. Anyway, he did Uzumaki and Gyo. I'm probably butchering the pronunciations of everything, so for that I apologize. But the interesting things to me about these things is I don't think they were particularly scary, but they had this amazing sense of dread and tension and just this unpleasantness where everything is just spiraling out of control and being terrible. And just this bleak, depressing outlook. And I think one of my favorite horror movies, which was an influence on Neverending Nightmares, has a similar feel, which is Cairo, I think it's called, or Pulse in America, but don't see the American version, because that one's terrible and completely different, but the Japanese one is amazing, because it captures this bleakness of everyday life almost, and puts a horror spin on it. Anyway, so that movie is highly recommended. It's directed by, I can't remember his first name, but I believe his last name is Kurosawa, but he's not related to Akira Kurosawa. So, anyway, definitely check that movie out. But I think, to me, horror can really be distilled to tension, and I think a lot of narratives really boil down to tension. I mean, you know, in an action movie or just a traditional narrative, you know, there's the rising action, climax, and resolution, and that's really just a chart for tension. But I think obviously the horror tension is a different kind of tension, but it's similar, and it's the most important element to a horror game or any sort of horror work of art. And I think there's a lot of you know, talk about horror and jump scares and, you know, what makes a good horror game or movie, but I think the key element is maintaining that tension and keeping people afraid and tense because they don't know what will happen. And I think once the person knows what will happen, or that thing happens, you've essentially lost the tension. So, I think if you look at, like, H.P. Lovecraft, he has a very interesting way of building tension where he doesn't even bother, I guess sometimes he does, but a lot of times he doesn't really describe the event, the horrific event. He just describes people's reactions to it and how maddening it was and how undescribable things were, and I think that's an interesting way to keep the tension. So, like, he can start talking about, like, oh, you know, I was in the asylum for 3 years because of something I saw, and it was so terrifying, and let me tell you about how terrifying it is. Almost more like H.P. Lovecraft style is telling you more about how terrifying something is than actually what happened. And I think that's an interesting way to frame the narrative, and I think that plays a role in how we do fulfillment. How we relieve that tension and balance the tension in games, and I think it's about not showing too much, not revealing too much. And certainly in my own dissection of Alien Isolation, I felt like they showed the alien too much, and then it just became commonplace. And some have said similarly, we showed our enemies too much in Neverending Nightmares, which certainly may be true. So I think obviously tension you can create with enemies, some sort of dread, fear of the unknown, fear of what's around the corner. I think another big part of a good horror game is the atmosphere. If you're walking around and you're like in Candyland and everything looks super fun and super great, you're not going to be overly scared or intimidated because, the atmosphere is different. I think that's why there are a lot of common tropes in horror, because they're things we're all afraid of. We're afraid of the dark, the unknown, being out of reach from others. And so I think that's the atmosphere, the tension. I think those are the real characteristics of a good horror game, and there's a number of different avenues to create those, but certainly I think Amnesia does a really good job of creating that sort of fear of the enemies because you can't look at them or you'll go insane. I think that's an interesting, a really, really good mechanic, and sometimes I get asked if I'm personally offended by the insanity mechanics in video games, and personally I'm not. I mean, I don't know if they really help people understand a mental illness, but they definitely can be effective. I mean, certainly if someone's talking about eternal darkness, that's the first thing they talk about. Oh, it was so cool when, I thought it was deleting my save, or some of the other crazy insanity effects. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to get to the same endpoint, but good horror game design is really about tension and atmosphere and scares, I guess. You can just have a very atmospheric horror game without a lot of jump scares, or you can have a horror game that's only jump scares. But certainly I prefer the atmospheric, the ones that are more about building up tension and rather than just startling you. And certainly Silent Hill is my favorite horror series. They did a really great job building that tension. Anyway, thanks for watching.